That sound, that was the sound of defeat. Not the dramatic, fiery explosion of a dogfight, not the scream of a diving Stuka, but something far worse. The sound of nothing. The sound of a dead engine on a grounded bomber. A flying fortress, one of the most powerful war machines ever built, brought to its knees not by German flak or Messerschmitts, but by nothing. By an invisible enemy it couldn't fight. The thunder of 1,000 engines. The 8th Air Force, a steel constellation against the bruised European sky. This is 1944. This is the armada of democracy on its way to Berlin, to Hitler's very doorstep. This is the sound of American industrial might, of unbreakable will. But it is a sound that almost wasn't. A sound that was nearly silenced forever by a problem so small, so seemingly insignificant, that the top brass and the enemy intelligence services missed it completely. A problem that could fit in the palm of your hand. This is the story of a triumph born not in a general's war room, but in a grimy, sand-choked maintenance hangar. The story of how one man, a mechanic with grease under his fingernails and a headache born of pure frustration, looked at a pile of junk and saw a solution. How his junkyard spark plug fix kept not 1, not 10, but 200 B-17s flying over the heart of the Third Reich. This is the story of the war the history books often forget, the war against the machines themselves, and the unsung genius who helped win it. To understand the sheer scale of this near catastrophe, we have to go back to the sun-bleached, fly-infested airfields of North Africa. Late 1942. The stage is set for Operation Torch. The Americans are here, fresh-faced, optimistic, and armed with what they believe is a war-winning weapon, the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. Picture these boys. Kids from Kansas farms, New York City streets, California orchards. They've seen the posters, they've heard the speeches. The B-17 is a legend already. 4 massive R 1820 Cyclone engines. 13.50 caliber machine guns. It can take a beating and still bring its crew home. It's a fortress, they said. It will fly so high, so fast, that enemy fighters won't be able to touch it. And the Germans? They looked at these new American bombers and they thought, let me set the scene for you. Imagine a German intelligence officer, let's call him Hauptmann Weber, sipping a coffee in a comfortable Parisian cafe, miles from the front. He's just read the report on the B-17. He scoffs. A clumsy, slow bomber, he tells his colleague. It has no forward-firing guns. Our fighters will come right up its nose and tear it to pieces. It is a flying coffin. This wasn't just arrogance, it was a calculated, and initially, a correct assessment. The early B-17s, the F models, had a fatal flaw. That big, beautiful nose was a glass house, a vulnerable target. The Germans developed tactics specifically for it, the head-on attack, the Sturmbach, the battering ram. But the Americans, we learn, we adapt. By the time the B-17G rolls off the production lines, it's got a chin turret. 2 more .50 calories staring right back at those oncoming German aces. Suddenly, that head-on attack isn't so appealing. The fortress is living up to its name. But the Luftwaffe wasn't the only enemy. There was another, more insidious foe. One that didn't wear a uniform, one that couldn't be shot down. The environment. North Africa. The airfields are little more than packed dirt and dust. And I'm not talking about a little bit of dirt. I'm talking about a fine, talcum powder-like silica dust that gets everywhere. It's in your food, your water, your eyes, your lungs. And for the B-17, it was a death sentence. You see, an aircraft engine is a masterpiece of precision. Thousands of moving parts, all needing clean air, clean fuel, perfect spark. The Cyclone engines had these complex, troublesome things called breeze cartridge starters. To get these massive engines turning, you'd fire a cartridge, basically a shotgun shell, that spun the engine over. It was violent, it was loud, and it blew unburned powder and filth directly into the cylinders. Combine that with the North African dust, a dust so fine it bypassed the air filters, and you have a recipe for disaster. The dust acted like sandpaper inside the engine, scouring the cylinder walls, grinding down the electrodes on the spark plugs. These weren't the simple spark plugs in your car. These were massive, complex things, and they were failing at an astronomical rate. Imagine this scene. A young crew chief, Sergeant Joe Dusty Miller from Ohio. He's been up all night. His fortress, Memphis Belle's bad sister, is scheduled for a mission at dawn. He's changed the spark plugs on engine number 3 twice. He's cleaned them, he's prayed over them. The pilot runs up the engines for a pre-flight check. 1, 2 for purr like kittens. Number 3? A sputter. A misfire. A cloud of black, oily smoke. It's down on power. It's sick. The pilot kills the engines, leans out of the cockpit window, his face a mask of frustration. Sarge, I can't take her up like this. She'll never make formation, she'll be a sitting duck. Dusty just stares at the offending engine, his hands on his hips, his coveralls stained with sweat and oil. He's exhausted. He's got a stack of paperwork a mile high demanding more spark plugs from supply. And supply has nothing. The entire theater is suffering. The entire offensive is grinding to a halt, not because of the enemy, but because of a 2-inch piece of metal and ceramic. This was the reality. The mighty 8th Air Force, the sword being forged to strike at Germany, was being blunted before it even left the ground. Bombers were sitting idle, hangar queens, cannibalized for parts to keep a handful of others flying. Morale wasn't just low, it was subterranean. The pilots and crews, they were ready to face the flak, ready to duel with the Focke-Wulfs. But this was a slow, demoralizing death by 1,000 cuts. A bureaucratic nightmare. And this is where our story finds its hero. Not a dashing pilot with 5 kills, not a general with a chest full of medals, but a master sergeant, a mechanic. His name was, well, history never quite recorded it. He was one of thousands. But his solution would echo across the entire European theater. He was working in a maintenance depot, a place that looked more like a mechanical graveyard. Wrecked B-17s, their fuselages ripped open, wings scattered like dinosaur bones. And in the middle of it all, a pile of discarded, used, carbon-fouled spark plugs. A mountain of failure. Most people saw junk. He saw potential. The official manuals were clear. When a spark plug is fouled, you replace it. But what do you do when there are no replacements? You get creative. You get desperate. He noticed something. The plugs weren't all failed in the same way. Some were oil-fouled. Some were lead-fouled from the low-grade fuel. Some were just coated in that infernal dust. What if you could clean them? Not just wipe them off, but really clean them? Restore them? A sandblaster. A simple, brutal tool used for stripping paint off metal. He took a hopelessly fouled plug, one that wouldn't spark if you hooked it up to a lightning bolt, and he carefully, meticulously sandblasted the electrodes. He blew out the grit. He cleaned the threads. It was a Hail Mary. It was against every regulation. He installed the reclaimed plug into a test engine. He held his breath. The mechanic hit the starter. The engine coughed, then roared to life. It ran smoothly. The RPMs climbed, steady and strong. It worked. It actually worked. He hadn't just fixed a spark plug. He had discovered a process. A way to bring the dead back to life. He started a production line right there in the junkyard. A team of mechanics, sorting, sandblasting, testing. They were no longer just fixing planes. They were recycling the very lifeblood of the air war. The news spread through the maintenance depots like wildfire. Suddenly, the mountain of junk wasn't a monument to failure. It was a gold mine. The junkyard spark plug was born. But this was just a local fix. A band-aid on a hemorrhaging wound. The real test was yet to come. Because while this sergeant was solving the problem in the dust of Africa, a much larger storm was gathering over the green fields of England. The 8th Air Force was preparing for its greatest test, the big week, the round-the-clock assault on German industry. They would need every fortress, every liberator, every single engine they could get. And as the planners looked at their maps of Germany, at the targets deep in enemy territory, they knew they had a critical, unsolvable problem. A problem of range. To hit Berlin, to truly bring the war home to the Nazis, they needed their fighters, their little brothers, the P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts, to fly deeper than ever before. But how? The answer would come from another piece of overlooked genius, another junkyard fix that would do the impossible. And it would hinge on the very spark plugs that this unknown sergeant had just saved from the trash heap. Because those cleaned, refurbished plugs didn't just keep the bombers flying, they would become the key to unleashing a storm over Berlin that the Luftwaffe believed was impossible. So, as the sun set over the airfields of North Africa, a quiet revolution was underway in a maintenance hangar. But halfway across the continent, in the war rooms of Germany, the Luftwaffe High Command was still confident. Still sure that the American bombers could never truly threaten the Reich. They had underestimated the machine. Now, they were about to underestimate the man who kept it running. But how do you take a local fix and scale it to an entire air force? And what does a spark plug have to do with the range of a fighter plane? The answer is a chain of events so unlikely it would change the course of the air war and seal the fate of the Third Reich. So, we left our unnamed hero in the dust-choked graveyard of North Africa, performing miracles with a sandblaster and a pile of junk. He'd found a way to keep a handful of bombers in the fight. But this was 1943 now. The war was escalating. And in the damp, chilly airfields of England, the 8th Air Force was building a sledgehammer. A sledgehammer meant for one target above all others, Berlin. The problem was the hammer was too short. It couldn't reach. Picture the scene at a base like Molesworth or Bassingbourn. A mist hangs over the patchwork fields. Row upon row of B-17s, their olive-drab fuselages dripping with condensation, look like sleeping giants. Crews are shuffling towards them, carrying parachutes, looking up at a sky that promises flak and fighters. These men are the point of the spear. But a spear is useless if you can't throw it far enough. The bombers needed escorts. The P-47 Thunderbolts, with their massive radial engines, were tough, but they were gas guzzlers. They could only go about 175 miles into enemy territory. That left a gap, a deadly void over the most critical targets in Germany, which the Luftwaffe called the yawning void, and they waited there with everything they had. The German High Command, men like Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, they looked at the maps and they did the math. They sneered. The American bombers would have to fly that gauntlet alone. It was a slaughterhouse. They called it the Luftwaffe's happy time. American airmen had another name for it, Black Thursday. The day the 8th lost 60 bombers in a single raid on Schweinfurt. 60 bombers. 600 men. In one day, the air war was at a stalemate and we were losing. The price in blood was unsustainable. The crews were starting to believe they were on a one-way ticket. They'd look at the empty bunks in the Nissen huts, hear the silence where there used to be laughter, and a cold, hard truth was setting in. Without a fighter that could go all the way to Berlin and back, the daylight bombing campaign was a suicide pact. The solution, as it so often does in American history, came from a combination of stubbornness, luck, and a refusal to follow the rules. And it started, improbably, with a fuel tank. Not a fancy, pressurized, engineered from scratch tank. We're talking about a piece of sheet metal, crudely welded together in a depot in the UK, designed to be dropped. The Tokyo tank, for the P-51 Mustang. But the Mustang had a secret, a British heart, the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, that gave it the legs for the long journey. All it needed was the extra gas. Now, here's where our spark plug story dovetails into the fighter story in a way that still gives me chills. You see, to carry those extra external tanks, to fly for 6, 7, 8 hours at a stretch, the fighters had to run their engines at a continuous, high-power setting. Maximum cruise. It was a brutal strain on the engine. And the most vulnerable point? The spark plugs. A fouled plug, a misfiring cylinder, at 30,000 feet over Germany? It wasn't an inconvenience. It was a death sentence. A loss of power meant you couldn't keep up with the formation. You'd lag behind. You'd become a straggler. And the German fighters, like wolves, they looked for stragglers. So, the same crisis that had grounded the bombers in Africa was now a lurking threat for the fighters over Europe. But because of that unnamed master sergeant and his sandblaster, because the maintenance depots had adopted his junkyard process, the 8th Air Force had a hidden advantage, a renewable supply of reliable spark plugs. They had solved the logistics nightmare before it could cripple the entire escort fighter force. It was a chain of ingenuity. A fix in the desert ensured that a fix in the sky could work. The fighters could now run their engines hard and clean, all the way to Berlin. But the Luftwaffe still didn't believe it. They dismissed the early, tentative, long-range escort missions as flukes. The enigmas are reckless, they are wasting their fighters, they'd say. The arrogance was breathtaking. They were so convinced of their own technical and tactical superiority, so mired in their belief that their Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf Fw-190s were inherently better, that they failed to see the revolution happening right in front of them. They didn't see the P-51 Mustangs, sleek and beautiful and deadly, climbing through the thin, cold air, their Merlin engines humming, their spark plugs firing in perfect sequence, carrying drop tanks that would let them fly to the Reich's capital and back. Let me tell you about one of those pilots. A young man, let's call him Lieutenant James Jimmy Reed. A kid from Chicago. He's 22 years old. He's sitting in the cockpit of his P-51, Daisy May. He's got a photograph of his girlfriend tucked into the instrument panel. He's nervous. Today's the day. The target isn't a coastal target, it's not the outskirts. Today, they're going to Berlin. He's running through his pre-flight checks. Fuel pressures, oil temps, magneto check. The engine purrs. He thinks about the spark plugs firing away in their 18 cylinders. He doesn't know the story of the sergeant in Africa. He doesn't know about the sandblasting. He just knows his engine is running smoothly. And for that, he is profoundly, silently grateful. The group commander's voice crackles over the radio. All right, let's get them started. Start engines. Jimmy signals his crew chief, gives him a thumbs up. The chief pulls the propeller through and then hits the starter. The big propeller lurches, then turns, and the engine coughs once, twice, and then erupts into its powerful signature roar. A sound that is about to become the soundtrack of the Luftwaffe's nightmare. All across the airfield, the Mustangs and Thunderbolts come to life. It's a symphony of raw power. They taxi out, a line of sharks moving towards the runway. Then, one by one, they pour on the coal and lift into the gray English sky, climbing into the formations that will shepherd the bombers. The mission is on. The point of no return has been crossed. But the Germans are waiting. They have their own aces, battle-hardened veterans with hundreds of kills. Men like Walter Nowotny, who looked at the incoming American formations and saw not a threat, but a target-rich environment. The Luftwaffe's strategy was simple and had been brutally effective up to this point. Ignore the fighters, smash the bombers. What they didn't account for was a new American tactic, born of desperation and now enabled by this new long-range power. The fighters weren't just tied to the bombers anymore. They were unleashed. They were given a new, aggressive order: go hunt. So, as the bomber stream droned on, a wall of fortresses and liberators, the Mustangs and Jugs, they swept ahead. They went down on the deck. They attacked the Luftwaffe on the ground. They strafed airfields. They caught German fighters as they were taking off and landing, when they were slow, low, and vulnerable. The shock was total. Imagine you're a German pilot, you've just scrambled, you're racing down the runway, your wheels are barely up, and suddenly the sky is filled with tracers. American fighters. Over your airfield. It was unimaginable. It was a violation of their tactical dogma. The yawning void was suddenly filled with the snarl of Packard Merlin engines. The happy time was over. And through it all, through the dogfights that spun from 30,000 feet down to the treetops, through the shuddering impact of cannon shells, through the gut-wrenching fear and the dizzying euphoria of a kill, those little spark plugs just kept firing. Cycle after cycle. Minute after minute. Hour after hour. The reclaimed, sandblasted, junkyard spark plugs were the unsung, invisible heroes of the air war, the tiny, relentless heartbeat of the fighter offensive. Jimmy Reed would make it to Berlin that day. He'd see the flak, the great black smudges of death that filled the sky. He'd tangle with a flight of 190s, feel the G-forces press him into his seat, smell the cordite from his own guns. And he'd make it back. He'd land at his base in England, his fuel gauges reading empty, his engine coughing on the last vapors in the lines. But it had held. It had all held. He'd climb out of the cockpit, his legs shaking from adrenaline and fatigue, and he'd pat the fuselage of Daisy May. He'd thank his crew chief. He still wouldn't know the story of the spark plugs. But we do. The chain was complete. The ingenuity of the mechanic in the desert had empowered the ingenuity of the fighter commanders in England. The Luftwaffe's greatest advantage, the depth of its territory, had been systematically dismantled by a piece of sheet metal and a cleaned-off piece of ceramic. But the final crushing blow was yet to be delivered. The Germans, reeling, were about to make one last, desperate miscalculation. They would look at their mounting losses, at the bombers now hitting targets with impunity, and they would decide to bet everything on one final, glorious, decisive battle. A massive, all-or-nothing aerial ambush. They were planning a trap they were sure would break the back of the 8th Air Force once and for all. They were gathering every fighter, every ace, every last resource for one colossal punch. What they didn't know was that the Americans were ready. We had broken their codes. We knew the trap was coming, and we weren't going to avoid it. We were going to walk right into it, with 200 flying fortresses, each one kept in the air by a mechanic's stubborn refusal to accept defeat. The stage was set for the greatest, most brutal air battle in history. A battle that would decide the fate of Europe. And it would all hinge on a simple question. Could those junkyard spark plugs hold up under the strain of a fight that would push man and machine to the absolute limit? So the escorts could now reach all the way to Berlin. The yawning void was a void no more. It was now a hunting ground for American fighters. But for the Germans, this wasn't a defeat. Not in their minds. It was an insult, a provocation, and it was about to trigger a reaction of sheer, unadulterated fury. The Luftwaffe had to do something drastic, something that would claw back control of the skies over the fatherland. And so, they began to plan. They would turn their desperation into a weapon. They would use the overwhelming pride of their fighter arm to lure the Americans into a single, massive, decisive battle. A Vernichtungsschlacht, a battle of annihilation. They were going to throw every single fighter they had into the air. Every ace, every rookie, every last bullet. They would create a meat grinder in the sky so terrifying, so bloody, that the Americans would simply stop coming. What they didn't know was that we were listening. In the quiet, hallowed halls of Bletchley Park, British intelligence was deciphering German codes. The ultra-secret. And they were reading the Luftwaffe's mail. They saw the orders going out. The concentration of fighter groups. The stockpiling of fuel and ammunition at specific airfields deep inside Germany. They saw the trap being set. And the American response? Don't avoid it. Spring it. The plan was audacious, almost suicidal. The 8th Air Force would send not just one raid, but a series of massive, consecutive raids, right into the heart of the Luftwaffe's strength. They would accept the challenge. They would meet this gathering storm head-on, with a storm of their own. The target for the main event? The very symbol of Nazi power, Berlin. The mission was scheduled for a clear, cold morning in early 1944. The briefing officers pulled back the curtain on the maps, and a collective gasp went through the room. There was the Big B, Berlin. You have to understand what Berlin meant to these crews. It was the most heavily defended city on Earth. A fortress in the sky. A labyrinth of flak towers whose guns could fire over 20,000 feet into the air. And now, they knew the Luftwaffe was waiting for them there, specifically for them, with everything they had. The mood in the briefing room was a thick cocktail of fear, determination, and fatalism. These men weren't naive. They knew the odds. They'd seen the empty chairs in the mess hall. They'd heard the stories of bombers coming back with half a crew, the fuselage looking like Swiss cheese. Now, let's zoom in on one of those bombers. Let's go back to Memphis Belle's bad sister. Our crew chief, Sergeant Dusty Miller, had finally gotten her running right. He'd personally sandblasted and tested every single spark plug in all 4 Wright Cyclones. He'd signed his name on the maintenance log with a feeling that was part pride, part prayer. Her pilot, a young man from Oregon named Captain John Jack Corrigan, stood in that briefing room, his knuckles white as he gripped the back of the chair in front of him. Berlin. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. He thought of his wife's last letter, the one where she told him about the cherry blossoms back home. It felt like a letter from another lifetime. After the briefing, Jack walked out onto the hardstand where his fortress was parked. Dusty was there, making one last check. "She's good to go, Captain," Dusty said, wiping his hands on an oily rag. "Engines are purring. Plugs are clean as a whistle." Jack looked up at the massive plane, its aluminum skin glinting in the weak English sun. "They're all waiting for us, Dusty. The whole damn Luftwaffe." Dusty spat on the ground. "Let 'em wait. They're waiting for a fortress. They ain't waiting for this one. This one's got a little something extra." He tapped the engine nacelle with affection. He didn't mean the guns. He meant the countless hours, the reclaimed parts, the stubborn refusal to let this particular machine fail. It was a feeling, an intangible spirit woven into the very metal of the plane. That night, nobody slept. Men wrote letters. Some played quiet games of poker, the stakes meaningless. Others just lay in their bunks, staring at the corrugated metal ceiling, listening to the wind moan around the Nissen hut, each man alone with his thoughts, his fears, his memories of home. Before dawn, they were woken. The pre-flight meal was a silent affair. The famous briefing joke fell flat. Then the ritual of suiting up. The electric heated suits, the heavy fleece jackets, the leather flight jackets on top. The parachute harness. It was a cumbersome, claustrophobic process. Each piece of gear was a reminder of the unnatural environment they were about to enter, the sub-zero, oxygen-starved hell at 25,000 feet. Then the trucks out to the hardstands. The crews gathered around their planes. Some pilots said a few words. Some crews had a shared prayer. For Jack Corrigan's crew, it was a handshake, a look in the eye. Nothing more needed to be said. They climbed in. The hatches clanged shut. The world became a capsule of aluminum and tension. "All right, let's settle down." Jack's voice came over the intercom, calm, steady, a tone he absolutely did not feel. "Pilot to crew. Check in." One by one, the voices came back. Navigator, bombardier, radio operator, engineers, gunners. All present. All scared. Crew chief to pilot. It was Dusty's voice, from the ground, plugged into an external jack. "You're all green on my end, Captain. Give him hell." "Thanks, Sarge. We'll bring her home." Then, the moment of truth. The order came over the radio. "Start engines." Jack took a deep breath. This was it. The culmination of everything. The chain of ingenuity that led from a sandblaster in Africa to this damp English morning, all riding on the performance of 52 spark plugs. Starting number 3. The engineer pulled the lever. The breeze cartridge fired with a loud bang, a sound like a cannon shot that always made new crewmen jump. The propeller on engine 3 jerked, then began to turn. The engine coughed, sputtered, and then roared to life, a deep, powerful, steady rumble. One by one, the other engines followed. Soon, all 4 cyclones were running, a symphony of controlled power that vibrated through the entire airframe. No misfires, no rough idle, just pure, reliable thrust. Jack let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Dusty had come through. All across the airfield, the same scene was playing out. 200 flying fortresses, their engines thundering, their propellers slicing the fog into streamers. It was a sound that shook the very earth. A sound of impending judgment. That exited. A slow, ponderous procession of giants moving towards the runway. Then, one by one, they accelerated down the tarmac, their engines screaming, lifting sluggishly into the air, heavy with bombs and fuel. It took nearly an hour for the entire formation to assemble. It was a breathtaking, terrifying sight. A vast, sprawling armada of aircraft, stacking itself into combat boxes, layer upon layer, until it filled the sky as far as the eye could see. They turned east, towards the coast, towards the enemy. And high above them, weaving like protective angels, were the fighters. The P-51s, their drop tanks still attached, saving every last ounce of fuel for the fight to come. Jimmy Reed was up there in Daisy May, his eyes constantly scanning the sky, his gut tight with anticipation. He knew what was waiting. As the coast of Holland slid beneath them, the first, tentative puffs of black smoke appeared off to the left. Inaccurate, ranging shots. A gentle reminder from the ground. "We see you." Then came the first radio calls from the fighter screen. "Bandits. 10 o'clock high. Looks like a gaggle of 109s." The battle had begun. But these were just the spoiling attacks, the jabs to test their defenses. The main event, the great aerial ambush, was still ahead. The Luftwaffe was holding back its best punch, waiting for the bombers to get deeper, to be more committed, more tired. Jack Corrigan gripped the control yoke, his shoulders already aching from the constant minor corrections needed to hold station in the formation. He looked out at the sea of bombers around him, a city in the sky, and he thought of the chain that had brought them here. The mechanics' fix, the long-range tanks, the broken codes. It all came down to this. To the next few hours. The formation droned on, deeper into Germany. The flak grew thicker, more accurate. The black puffs blossomed around them, shaking the plane with violent concussions. A nearby fortress took a direct hit, a wing shearing off in a blinding flash of orange and black. It spun down, a cartwheeling torch. No shoots. Just like that, 10 men gone. The intercom was silent except for essential calls. The tension was a physical presence in the plane, thick enough to choke on. And then, the radio erupted with a new, more urgent warning. It was the voice of a fighter pilot, sharp with alarm. "All bomber units, be advised. Big friendlies at 12 o'clock, and I mean big. The roof is about to come in." It was what they had been waiting for. The Tungschlacht. The Luftwaffe's master stroke. The storm was about to break. The roof is about to come in. That single, chilling transmission from a fighter pilot high above the bomber stream said everything. It wasn't just a squadron of Messerschmitts or a group of Focke-Wulfs. This was different. This was the main event. Jack Corrigan, hunched in the pilot's seat of Memphis Belle's bad sister, felt his blood run cold. He peered through the greenhouse canopy, and his breath caught in his throat. The high, thin cirrus clouds ahead of them, they seemed to be moving. But they weren't clouds. They were contrails. Hundreds of them. A vast, swarming hive of German fighters, stacked in layers, diving from the sun. It was the entire available strength of the Luftwaffe's defense forces, thrown into a single, desperate, coordinated attack. This was it. The battle of annihilation. And in that moment, a strange calm settled over Jack. The waiting was over. The fear was still there, a live wire in his gut, but it was now secondary to the task at hand. Fly the plane. Hold the formation. Survive. Pilot to crew, he said, his voice surprisingly steady. This is it. They're coming in. Everyone looks sharp. Gunners, watch for the rocket trains. They're gonna try to break us up. What unfolded next was not a dogfight. It was a melee. A sprawling, chaotic, and utterly brutal aerial massacre on a scale never seen before or since. The German tactics were brutal in their simplicity. The heavy twin-engine Bf-110s and Ju-88s hung back, just outside the range of the .50 caliber guns. They fired salvos of underwing rockets, 21 centimeters mortars, into the heart of the bomber formations. These weren't precision weapons. They were area denial weapons. Walls of fire and shrapnel designed to blast holes in the neat American combat boxes, to isolate stragglers, to sow chaos. The first rocket salvo exploded 100 yards ahead of Jack's plane. The fortress bucked violently, like a ship hitting a rogue wave. The air filled with the smell of cordite and the terrifying ping of shrapnel fragments ripping into their wings and fuselage. Left waist to pilot, they blew a hole right through the low squadron. They're scattering. And then the single-engine fighters came in. The Focke-Wulf 190s, the butcher birds, screaming down in pairs, their cannons blazing. They ignored the American escorts. Their target was the bombers. Always the bombers. The sky became a hellish canvas of tracers, black flak puffs, burning aircraft, and blossoming parachutes. It was impossible to focus on any one thing. The sheer sensory overload was paralyzing. In the top turret of Jack's plane, the engineer, Sergeant Mike "Pop" O'Reilly, a 35-year-old father of two from Pennsylvania, traversed his twin .50s, his face a mask of grim concentration. A Focke-Wulf filled his sights, coming head-on. He squeezed the triggers. The guns hammered, the empty shell casings cascading around him in a brassy shower. He saw his rounds walk up the fighter's engine cowling. A puff of smoke, then a gout of flame. The 190 rolled onto its back and plunged past them, missing their wing by feet. "Got one!" Pop yelled, but there was no time for celebration. Another was already lining up from 3 o'clock high. Down in the ball turret, suspended beneath the belly of the fortress, was the youngest member of the crew, 19-year-old Corporal Leo, the Kid Finney. He was locked in a metal sphere, spinning and twisting, firing at fighters as they passed underneath. It was a disorienting, terrifying job. He saw the world upside down and right side up in a dizzying blur. A 109 flashed beneath him. He let it, squeezed his triggers. Tracers reached out. He saw pieces fly off the German's wing. It was like the world's most violent video game, except the stakes were his life and the lives of his 9 crewmates. And through it all, the 4 Wright Cyclone engines just kept running. They drank the high-octane fuel, the clean, sandblasted spark plugs firing thousands of times a minute, indifferent to the carnage unfolding around them. The constant, powerful vibration through the airframe was a reassurance, a tactile promise that they were still in the fight. Jack found himself talking to them, a low, desperate mantra under his breath. "Come on, number 2. Hold together, baby. Just hold together." But the fortresses around them were not so lucky. The air was a junkyard of falling metal. A B-17 to their right took a direct hit in the bomb bay. It disappeared in a blinding, sun-bright flash, the concussion wave slamming into their plane like a physical blow. 1 second it was there, 10 men inside, the next, an expanding ball of fire and smoke. No debris, just vaporized. Another, its wing sheared off by a rocket, spun down in a flat, horrifying cartwheel, shedding pieces as it fell. The radio was a bedlam of panic, cool-headed instructions, and final, heartbreaking transmissions. "Mayday, mayday. This is Lucky Lady, we're on fire. Number 3 and 4 out, trying to hold altitude. Bail out. For God's sake, bail out. I can't get the hatch open. The handle's jammed. Tommy, get the transmission cuts off." The sheer volume of the attack was overwhelming. The American fighter escorts, the P-51s and P-47s, were fighting their own desperate battle on the fringes, trying to cut the Germans down before they could reach the bomber stream. It was a knife fight in a phone booth. Up in Daisy May, Jimmy Reed was in his element. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, hyper-focused rage. He saw a flight of 190s lining up for a pass on a wounded B-17 lagging behind the formation. He shoved the throttle forward, the Merlin engine howling in response. He dove, his wingman following. Brake left, fort," he yelled over the radio, knowing they probably couldn't hear him. He fired a warning burst ahead of the lead 190. The German pilot, startled, broke off his attack. Jimmy latched onto his tail. A short, brutal burst from his 6.50 caliber machine guns and the 190's cockpit dissolved into a cloud of plexiglass and blood. The plane nosed down and began its long, final fall. But for every German he shot down, 2 more seemed to take its place. The Luftwaffe was throwing itself at the bomber stream with a frenzied, almost suicidal abandon. They knew this was their chance. Their one, great, decisive battle. The climax of the fight came over the initial point, the start of the bomb run. For the next 10 interminable minutes, the bombers had to fly straight and level. No evasive action. Their lives depended entirely on the tightness of their formation and the skill of their gunners. The flak intensified, becoming a solid, black wall of exploding steel ahead of them. Jack Corrigan tightened his grip on the yoke. "Pilot to Bombardier. You have the plane. Bombardier has the plane." Now, they were just a platform, a delivery system. The world outside narrowed to the crosshairs in the bomb site, the plane flying itself towards the heart of the inferno. Inside, Memphis Belle's bad sister, An eerie silence fell, broken only by the constant hammer of the guns and the shriek of wounded metal. Each man was alone with his part of the machine. The bombardier, staring into the eyepiece, his hands on the controls. The navigator, calculating wind drift. The gunners, sweeping their sectors, their voices hoarse from yelling. A 20mm cannon shell from a head-on attack ripped through the plexiglass nose. The navigator, Lieutenant Phil Rosen, cried out and slumped over his table. The bombardier, untouched, didn't even flinch. He had the aim. Steady, steady, bombs away. The plane lurched upward, suddenly 10,000 pounds lighter. The great, shining silver sticks of death fell away, tumbling down towards the city below. They had delivered their package. Now they just had to get home. The turn away from the target was the most vulnerable moment. The formation loosened, the flak was still thick, and the German fighters, sensing blood, pressed the attack with renewed fury. It was then that Jack felt it. A violent shudder ran through the airframe. A loud, grinding, screaming noise from number 2 engine. A bright stream of oil coated the windshield. A cannon shell had found its mark. Number 2's hit. She's on fire. Feathering number 2. The flight engineer frantically pulled the feathering lever, stopping the propeller to reduce drag. But they were losing power, losing airspeed. They began to lag, to fall behind the formation. The one thing you never, ever wanted to do. Almost immediately, 2 Focke-Wulfs peeled off from the main attack and swung onto their tail. They smelled blood. Tail gunner, they're coming straight at us. The tail gunner, isolated in the very back of the plane, opened fire. His twin .50s chattered. He hit one, saw it peel away smoking. But the other kept coming, its wings flashing with fire. Jack threw the heavy bomber into a desperate, sliding turn, a corkscrew, evasive maneuver. The G-forces pressed them into their seats. The airframe groaned in protest. But the 3 remaining engines, pushed to their absolute limit, responded. They didn't misfire. They didn't falter. The sandblasted, reclaimed Junkyard spark plugs in those cyclones fired and fired and fired, delivering every last ounce of power they had. The German pilot, frustrated by the bomber's unexpected maneuverability, overshot. For a brief second, he presented a perfect target to the top turret. Pop O'Reilly didn't miss. A long, sustained burst tore the Focke-Wulf's wing off. It spun away, out of control. The immediate threat was gone. But they were alone. A wounded bird, limping home across a sky still filled with hawks. The battle wasn't over. But the tide was turning. The American fighters, having broken the back of the initial German assault, were now roaming freely, picking off the disorganized enemy. The Luftwaffe's great, decisive battle was becoming their greatest defeat. Their losses were staggering. They had bet everything on this one roll of the dice, and they had lost. For Jack Corrigan and his crew, the war had narrowed to a single, agonizing objective: keep the plane in the air. On 3 engines, losing altitude, they began the long, lonely journey back to the coast, back to England, back to life. They had faced the fist of God and lived. And as they left the burning city behind them, the true scale of the American triumph began to dawn. The Luftwaffe had been broken, not by a secret weapon, but by the relentless, unwavering, and utterly dependable beating of 1,000 hearts, both human and mechanical. Hearts that had, in many cases, been brought back from the dead by a mechanic with a sandblaster and a refusal to quit. They were out of the flak. They were out of the main fighter screen. But they were not out of the woods. Memphis Belle's bad sister was wounded, bleeding altitude and fuel, a lone giant crawling across a hostile sky. The euphoria of the bomb run, the adrenaline spike of the dogfight, had bled away, leaving behind a cold, grinding exhaustion and the gnawing fear of the straggler. Inside the plane, the crew was tending to their wounds, both human and mechanical. The navigator, Phil Rosen, was conscious but bleeding from a gash on his forehead, the radio operator applying a crude bandage. The air was thick with the smells of sweat, cordite, and something else, the sharp, acrid scent of fear. Pilot to crew, Jack's voice was hoarse, stripped raw by yelling and oxygen masks. Damage report. One by one, the voices came back, each a testament to their narrow escape. Top turret operational. Port waist gun jammed, but we're okay. Ball turret's good, Captain. A few holes, but she spins. Tail section's a mess, Skipper. Controls are stiff, but I've still got movement. The flight engineer, Pop O'Reilly, was the most worried. Number 2 is a complete write-off. We've lost most of the oil from number 3, pressure's dropping. Fuel situation is not great. We've got multiple leaks in the starboard wing tanks. Jack processed this. 3 engines. One of them sick. Leaking fuel. They were hundreds of miles from home, with the North Sea, a freezing, merciless grave for downed airmen, still between them and safety. Navigator, Jack called, plot me a new course. Most direct route to the coast. Forget the rally point. We're taking the short way home. Roger, Skip. New course coming up. This was the part of the mission the briefings never covered. The long, lonely vigil after the battle. The agonizing calculus of distance, fuel, and structural integrity. Every minute stretched into an eternity. Every sputter from the ailing number 3 engine made 10 hearts skip a beat. They flew on, the silence in the intercom more deafening than the battle had been. Each man was lost in his own thoughts. Jack thought of Dusty, the crew chief, and his promise to bring the plane home. He looked at the gauges, the fuel needles dipping relentlessly towards empty. He thought of the spark plugs in the 3 remaining engines. Those simple, resurrected parts were now the only things standing between them and the cold sea. He had never prayed over a piece of machinery before, but he did now. Meanwhile, high above, their guardian angel was also running on fumes. Jimmy Reed in Daisy May had seen the wounded fortress leave the formation. Against orders, against common sense, he had peeled off with his wingman to shepherd the straggler home. Easy now, Fort, Jimmy's calm, Texas drawl crackled over the radio. We've got you in sight. Just keep her steady. We'll stick with you as long as we can. The sight of those 2 little Mustangs, weaving gently above them, was a balm to the soul of every man on the B-17. They weren't alone. But the Germans weren't finished. A lone, opportunistic Messerschmitt 109, low on fuel and ammunition itself, spotted the wounded bomber and its 2 escorts. It dove out of the sun, a shark seeing a chance for one last, easy kill. Bandit! 6 o'clock high. Jimmy's wingman yelled. The 2 Mustangs broke hard, turning into the attack. It was a short, vicious fight. Jimmy, his fuel gauges blinking warning lights, knew he had only 1 pass. He didn't waste it. A deflection shot, a touch of lead, a burst of fire. The 109 shuddered, smoke pouring from its engine. It broke off and dove away, disappearing into the haze below. That's the last of them, I think, Jimmy radioed. You're clear to the coast, Fort. We're at bingo fuel. We have to turn back. Roger, little friend, Jack said, the gratitude thick in his voice. We owe you one. Just get home, Jimmy replied. And with that, the 2 P-51s waggled their wings and turned west, leaving the lone B-17 to its fate. The coast of Holland appeared ahead, a thin, brown line on the horizon. It was the most beautiful sight Jack had ever seen. But they weren't safe yet. The North Sea lay before them, gray and unforgiving. Fuel's critical, Skip, Pop said, his voice tight. Number 3 is starting to run hot. I don't know if we have enough to make the English coast. It was a commander's nightmare. Do you ditch while you still have control, near potential rescue? Or do you press on, gambling everything on making landfall? We press on, Jack said, his jaw set. We've come too far to quit now. They crossed the coastline, leaving enemy territory behind. But the sea below was no friend. The engines, starved of fuel, began to cough and sputter. The number 3 engine seized with a horrible grinding sound, a cloud of black smoke marking its death. Now they were on 2 engines. The plane began to lose altitude faster. The English coast was a hazy smudge in the distance. Too far. Mayday, 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 the radio operator began to call. This is B-17 Memphis Belle's bad sister, position approximately 50 miles east of Lowestoft. On 2 engines losing altitude. Preparing to ditch. It looked like the story would end here, in the cold, gray water. But then a miracle. A Royal Air Force Air-Sea Rescue Walrus, a slow, ungainly amphibious biplane, appeared as if sent by divine providence. It had been vectored to their position by a listening post that had picked up their mayday. The walrus waddled alongside them, its pilot waving encouragingly. "Hold on, boys," the British voice came over the radio. "We've got boats on the way. Just hold her steady as you can." It was enough. That tiny glimpse of hope gave Jack the strength for one last effort. He nursed the 2 remaining engines, coaxing every last ounce of thrust from them. The spark plugs, pushed far beyond their designed lifespan, continued to fire. The English coastline grew larger, more detailed. They could see fields, roads. They were going to make it. Not to their base, but they were going to make land. With a final, gasping sputter, the last 2 engines quit. They were out of fuel. But they were over the beach. Jack fought the dead controls, aiming for a wide, flat field just beyond the sand dunes. The landing gear was useless. They hadn't had the hydraulic pressure to lower it. "Brace for impact," Jack yelled. Crash landing. The belly of the fortress hit the soft English earth with a tremendous roar of tearing metal. It skidded, plowing a deep furrow in the field, spinning slowly before coming to a jarring, sudden stop. Silence, broken only by the ping of cooling metal and the hiss of steam. For a moment, nobody moved. Then, one by one, they began to unbuckle, to check themselves and each other. They were alive. Bruised, battered, bleeding, but alive. 10 men. They had gone to Berlin and back. Jack Corrigan sat for a long moment, his hands still gripping the yoke, his body trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline and relief. He looked at the instrument panel, now dead and dark. He thought of the engines that had carried them through hell. He thought of the spark plugs. He unbuckled and climbed out of the cockpit, joining his crew as they stumbled out of the shattered fuselage into the cool, sweet English air. They sank to their knees on the grass, kissing the ground, laughing, crying. A farmer and his wife came running from a nearby cottage, carrying mugs of tea. The war was over for them. They had made it. The story of Memphis Belle's bad sister was one of hundreds that day. The great aerial battle over Berlin was a turning point, a strategic catastrophe from which the Luftwaffe never truly recovered. They had lost over 100 fighters and, more importantly, dozens of their irreplaceable veteran pilots. The myth of their invincibility was shattered. The skies over the Reich belonged to the Allies. The chain of ingenuity that made it possible, from the unnamed Sergeant Sandblaster to the long-range drop tanks to the codebreakers at Bletchley, had proven unbreakable. It was a triumph of American adaptability, of the ability to look at a problem, whether it was a pile of junk spark plugs or an impossible tactical dilemma, and find a solution. Jack Corrigan and his crew survived the war. Dusty Miller kept fixing planes. Jimmy Reed got 5 more kills, becoming an ace. But the real hero of this story is the spirit it represents. The spirit that refuses to accept that something is useless. The spirit that looks at a mountain of failure and sees a reservoir of potential. It's the spirit of the mechanic, the engineer, the problem solver. The quiet, determined individual whose work in the shadows enables the triumphs in the spotlight. Those B-17s, kept flying by reclaimed parts, didn't just drop bombs. They delivered hope. They hammered the machinery of tyranny into scrap. And they proved a timeless lesson. Never, ever underestimate the power of a stubborn person with a good idea and a pile of junk. Because sometimes, that's all it takes to change the world. The echo of those engines, of those millions of reliable sparks, still resonates today. It's in every challenge we face, every obstacle we're told is insurmountable. It's a reminder that the greatest weapon we possess isn't always the biggest or the most advanced. Sometimes, it's the one we were about to throw away, given a second chance. They were safe. On the ground. The war, for Jack Corrigan and his crew, was over. But the story of that day, the story of the spark plugs, of the great battle over Berlin, it didn't end in that muddy English field. It sent out ripples. It left an echo that would resonate through the rest of the war, and long, long after. Back at their home base, the news of Memphis Belle's bad sister's crash landing had spread like wildfire. When the trucks finally brought Jack and his weary crew back, they were met not with pity, but with a kind of awe. They were ghosts who had returned. Men who had stared into the furnace of the Luftwaffe's last great stand and walked away. And the first person to meet Jack as he stepped out of the truck was Master Sergeant Dusty Miller. The old mechanic didn't say a word. He just looked at Jack, his eyes red-rimmed from a sleepless night of worry. Then he looked past him at the empty hardstand where his plane should have been. His face fell. Jack walked over and put a hand on his shoulder. "We brought her home, Dusty," he said quietly. "Not all the way, but we put her down in one piece. She saved our lives. Every last part of her." Dusty nodded, swallowing hard. He understood. The plane was gone, but the men were here. That was the trade he'd have made every single time. Later, in the quiet of the maintenance hangar, surrounded by the skeletons of other bombers, Jack found the words. It was the engines, Sarge. After number 2 was hit, and number 3 was bleeding oil, the other 2. They just held on. They never missed a beat. All the way until the fuel ran out. I've never felt anything like it. Dusty allowed himself a small, grim smile. He walked over to a workbench and picked up a single, used spark plug, its electrodes clean and sharp. "They're good plugs," he said simply, holding it up to the light. "You just gotta know how to talk to 'em." That was the heart of it. The unspoken bond between the man who flew the machine and the man who gave it life. It was a trust forged in fire and oil, a language spoken in the steady rhythm of a healthy engine. The impact of that single, massive air battle was immediate and profound. The intelligence debriefs from returning crews painted a stunning picture. The Luftwaffe had been gutted. Not just in planes, but in experienced leaders, the Experten who had been the backbone of the defense. The German fighter arm, once the most feared in the world, was now a hollowed-out shell, forced to throw poorly trained boys into the sky against the relentless tide of American might. The Junkyard spark plug process, once a local secret, was now standard operating procedure across the entire 8th and 15th Air Forces. The mountain of discarded plugs wasn't a monument to failure anymore. It was a strategic reserve. It was a lesson in logistics that went all the way up to General Spaatz and General Doolittle. They understood that winning the war wasn't just about having more of everything. It was about making better use of what you had. It was about American ingenuity applied at every level, from the general's map to the sergeant's workbench. And the B-17s, those magnificent, rugged fortresses, kept flying. They flew through the spring of 1944, through D-Day, through the fall of France, and into the heart of Germany itself. Their contrails became a permanent feature of the European sky, the constant, droning symphony of an industrial giant that the Axis had profoundly, fatally underestimated. The story even found its way, in a roundabout fashion, to the very top. In a war room in Washington, a report crossed the desk of General Henry Hap Arnold, the head of the Army Air Forces. It detailed the dramatic increase in bomber availability and engine reliability, attributing it in part to aggressive and innovative reclamation and maintenance procedures at the depot level. It was dry, bureaucratic language, but it described the life's work of men like Dusty Miller. They had turned the tide of a paper war, a war of statistics and supply lines, and in doing so, they had won a vital battle long before the first bomb fell on a target. But what of the human cost? For every Jack Corrigan who made it back, there was a crew that didn't. The empty chairs in the mess hall remained empty. The letters home were sometimes the last words a family would ever receive from their son, their husband, their brother. The victory was real, it was decisive, but it was paid for in blood. This is the dual echo of war. The echo of triumph and the echo of loss. They are forever intertwined. The story of the spark plugs is a story of brilliance, but it is set against a backdrop of immense sacrifice. We tell these stories of ingenuity not to glorify war, but to honor the incredible lengths that ordinary people will go to in order to protect each other, to complete a mission, to see the dawn of a peaceful day. Years later, a much older Jack Corrigan, his hair gone gray, would take his grandson to a museum where a restored B-17 stood, gleaming under the lights. He'd point to the engines. "See those, Mikey?" he'd say, his voice soft. There were thousands of parts in that plane. But you know the ones I thought about the most? The spark plugs. Tiny little things. Without them, the whole thing was just metal. Silent. He'd place a hand on the cool aluminum of the wing, as if he could still feel the vibration. Someone figured out how to keep them working when there were no new ones to be had. Someone refused to give up. That's what won the war. Not just the big bombs or the famous generals. It was the stubbornness. The refusal to quit. That is the legacy. It's not just a story about a fix. It's a story about a mindset. A belief that no problem is too small to be insignificant, and no solution is too humble to be powerful. The Luftwaffe looked at the American war machine and saw clumsy bombers and simple mechanics. They saw what they wanted to see. They failed to see the resilience. They failed to see the creativity. They failed to see the quiet, determined genius of a sergeant who looked at a pile of junk and saw an air force. So the next time you face a problem that seems insurmountable, when the resources are thin and the odds are long, remember the echo in the metal. Remember the mechanic with his sandblaster. Remember the pilot who trusted his reclaimed engines all the way to Berlin and back. Your problem might not be a world war. Your spark plug might be a difficult conversation, a creative block, a financial hurdle. But the principle is the same. Look at what you have. Look at what others have thrown away. And ask yourself the same question that won the sky over Europe. What if I can make this work? That is the untold history. That is the lesson from the Junkyard. And it's a lesson that can still change the world. We followed the chain, from the desert sands to the skies over Berlin, from the crash landing in a field to the quiet reflection years later. But there's one more layer to this story. A deeper, more profound echo. Because the triumph of that single fix, that Junkyard spark plug, wasn't just a moment in time. It was part of a vast, unsung symphony. A symphony of millions of small, perfect acts performed by people whose names history never recorded. Think about it. For every B-17 that flew, there was an ecosystem of effort. The woman in a factory in Wichita, carefully winding the copper wire for a magneto, her hands moving with a rhythm born of repetition and pride. The teenager in a Pennsylvania mine, digging out the coal that would be turned into the high-octane fuel that powered those Wright cyclones. The farmer in Iowa, growing the crops that fed the soldiers who flew them. The truck driver braving icy roads to deliver the parts. The clerk in a warehouse, meticulously logging every single spark plug, every gallon of oil, every .50 caliber round. This was the arsenal of democracy, not as a slogan, but as a living, breathing, unimaginably complex organism. And at its very core, in its circulatory system, were men like our unnamed sergeant. The troubleshooters. The fixers. The ones who made the impossible possible. Let's give him a name, just for a moment. Let's call him Frank. Frank from Milwaukee. He owned a small auto repair shop before the war. He knew engines. He knew that sometimes the official manual was wrong. Sometimes, you had to listen to the machine. When Frank arrived in North Africa and saw that mountain of fouled spark plugs, he didn't see a supply problem. He saw a process problem. The official process was replace. But when you can't replace, you have to innovate. The sandblaster wasn't in the manual. It was a tool from his old shop, used to clean engine blocks. He saw a connection nobody else did. And Frank wasn't alone. In the Pacific, a crew chief figured out that by using a different grade of engine oil, he could extend the time between overhauls for his squadron's P-38 Lightnings. In a depot in England, a welder devised a new technique to patch flak damage twice as fast. These innovations weren't dreamed up in a laboratory. They were born on the front lines, out of sheer, gut-level necessity. This was the great, unquantifiable American advantage. It wasn't just that we could produce more. It was that we empowered the individual to think. A German mechanic was taught to follow the handbutch without deviation. An American mechanic was taught the principles of the machine and then trusted to use his head to keep it running. The German High Command, with its rigid hierarchy and its belief in inherent technological superiority, never grasped this. They expected the American war effort to be clumsy, slow, and dogmatic. They were waiting for us to make a massive, strategic blunder. They never anticipated that we would win the war 10,000 times over, in 10,000 small ways, on 10,000 different workbenches. This is the gritty, truth-seeking edge of our story. It strips away the romantic myth of war and reveals the raw, practical engine of victory, the collective intelligence and initiative of ordinary people. Let's go back to that airfield in England, a week after the Great Berlin Battle. The maintenance depots are buzzing, but there's a new feeling in the air. It's not just desperation anymore. It's confidence. The process for the spark plugs is now a well-oiled machine of its own. A team of GIs sorts the used plugs, oil fouled in one bin, carbon fouled in another, physically damaged in a third. The sandblasters run day and night. Test benches hum, verifying the clean plugs put out a perfect blue-white spark. A young, new mechanic, fresh from the States, watches the process with awe. He turns to Frank. "Sarge, they didn't teach us this in tech school." Frank gives him a wry smile, the one he used to give his apprentice back in Milwaukee. "Son, they can't teach you everything in school. They can only give you the basics. The rest you learn when you have to. When the lives of 10 good men are riding on you figuring it out." That was the real education. That was the transmission of a culture of can-do ingenuity that became the DNA of the 8th Air Force. And this culture had a direct, mathematical impact on the war. Before the spark plug reclamation process was scaled up, a B-17 might be mission-ready 60% of the time. After, that number could jump to 85% or higher. What does that mean in practical terms? It means that on any given day, instead of 150 bombers heading to a target, 200 could go. That's 50 more bombers, 500 more airmen, 125 more tons of bombs on target. It's a force multiplier of staggering proportions. The Luftwaffe intelligence, counting bombers on aerial photographs, was constantly baffled. They'd count the wrecked fortresses in their reports, they'd tally their kills. And yet, the American formations never seemed to shrink. If anything, they grew larger. It was as if the Americans had a secret, endless supply. In a way, they did. It was a supply of ideas. This is the ultimate irony, the subtle humor in the face of gravity. The Germans, who prided themselves on their engineering prowess, were ultimately defeated by a more profound and adaptable form of engineering. Not just engineering of machines, but engineering of systems, of logistics, of the human spirit itself. The echo of this triumph didn't end with Ide. It came home. Frank from Milwaukee went back to his auto shop, but he ran it differently. He encouraged his mechanics to experiment, to find better ways. The men who served under him brought that same problem-solving mindset to the industries that built post-war America, to our cars, our computers, our space program. The Junkyard spark plug is a metaphor for a national character trait, the ability to look at a limitation and see not a wall, but a door. To look at a pile of scrap and see a solution waiting to be born. So, when you hear that story of the 200 B-17s over Berlin, don't just think of the roaring engines and the brave men inside. Think of the quiet symphony happening below. The hiss of the sandblaster. The scratch of Frank's pen on a maintenance log. The determined, unyielding focus of a nation that refused to be grounded. Their symphony is the foundation of our world. And its final, enduring note is this: never, ever underestimate the power of a person who is willing to get their hands dirty to solve a problem. That single, simple idea, more than any secret weapon, is what keeps freedom flying.